5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni Viewer, and I had originally intended for that 4th part of the GOJIRA vs. SHIN series to be my final word on Shin Godzilla. Really, I did intend to stop. I know that there are those who think that I'm obsessed with hating on this movie, but honestly, I'm not that obsessed with it. I mean, it was what? A 5-year gap between the last time I spoke about it when it was still relatively fresh and when I started making the Shin vs. Gojira videos, and I hadn't really spoken that much about it other than a couple of times in passing. So I really had intended for this to be it, but something dawned on me. During that particular series where I compared Shin to the original Godzilla movie, I did mention that I said Shin was a propaganda film. Based on all the evidence, it had all the earmarks of what a propaganda film would be, particularly when it comes to how it's very lopsided in terms of what it thinks is right versus what it thinks is wrong, and how it delivers its message and everything. But I realized that I stopped just short of saying what the propaganda being put forward actually is. And that's quite an omission on my part. If I'm gonna make a claim about something, I should be able to back it up and say what it actually is in detail, right? So that's why I'm doing this little aftermath video, just to make sure that I have completely covered my bases and I can say for certain that I have actually demonstrated my point to the fullest of my abilities. So, this is taking a look at what Shin Godzilla's propaganda actually is. And I know some of you might think, well, wait a minute, don't we know what it is? It was based on Fukushima and the 3/11 events and government ineptitude when responding to that. Isn't it just very plainly about critiquing the Japanese government? Well, that is a part of it. But I think there's another message here. In fact, I know there is because the movie plainly states what that message is. But we'll get to that in a moment. Actually, we'll be getting to that by the end. First, let's actually take everything we know, all the evidence that we've gathered, piece it together, and see what kind of an image it makes. Okay, we're really gonna be jumping off of the 4th part of the Godzilla vs. Shin videos here, which means I would recommend watching that if you haven't yet. You should probably watch all of those videos in order to really understand, but the 4th one in particular is very important, because that is where I discussed the idea that Shin Godzilla doesn't seem particularly concerned with the people of Tokyo. But it is oddly obsessed with the infrastructure of Tokyo. Whenever we see shots of the city, the main focus is on the buildings, the trains, the cars driving around, the various different parts of the city just running as you would expect a city to run. That is what it's interested in. If people show up in the shot, they are seen from a distance, or they pass by very quickly, you don't really get much focus paid to them. In fact, shots of people in Tokyo are very brief throughout the entire film, whether there is something happening or not. The aftermath, the morning after scene where you have the smooth jazz music playing while different talking radio voices report on what happened, obviously that's one example of where you're laser focused on objects, but you're not focused on people. But during the actual attack where Godzilla first makes landfall, there's not really a focus on people there either. Yes, we see some of them, but again, they're mass crowds, or we get POV shots where the person is behind the camera. We literally cannot see them. Or they are filmed from a distance and the shots go by like that. You might miss them if you blink. So we have a clear sense that people are not in focus. aside from the characters who are working in the government, but I'll get to them later. This carries over into the moment when Godzilla finally torches all of Tokyo. And in particular, after he's done and he shuts down so he can catch 40 winks, we get a lot of lingering shots of the city on fire, buildings burning or crumbling, that wide shot that shows the flames from afar, the wreckage of the helicopter that the PM was in. But oddly, we don't see who was in that helicopter, not even before it was destroyed. And a little bit later, when we see the displacement scene, you'll recognize this, of course, if you saw the fourth part of the series. The shots of the displaced citizens feel like they were edited by a music video director with ADHD. Each shot goes by after like a second and a half or 2 seconds tops. The whole thing only lasts 13 seconds, as opposed to the original Gojira's aftermath sequence, which is a minute and a half, which may not be that long, but it's feature length compared to the aftermath scene from SHIN. But this is stuff I've already discussed. The fact that the movie is more interested in the infrastructure of Tokyo than it is on the people of Tokyo. Let's dive a little deeper. For this next part, let's zero in for a moment on when Godzilla makes landfall in his fourth form, which is when we finally have a proper military response mounted to try and stop him. We see the full force of the JSDF mobilized, helicopters, tanks, rocket launchers, soldiers on foot. Well, we don't really see soldiers on foot, really, unless, again, it's from a distance. And of course, because it's a kaiju movie, they throw everything they've got at Godzilla and barely make him blink. But also notice how this sequence is shot as well. Again, there are shots of the military commanders who are somewhere in relation to all of this, but when we're actually on the field, we're mostly focused on the vehicles. We occasionally get shots of the people within, but again, their faces are covered. This is another thing. If we do get a clear shot of a person, their face is usually covered by some kind of a mask, or it's obscured in some other way. And showing a person's face, like I mentioned in the video proper, that is how you make a connection with someone. Covering the face in some way is a dehumanizing thing. So, again, we're talking about the military here, so you could argue that's standard practice. You're supposed to be wearing the mask for oxygen if you're flying an aircraft or something. But in juxtaposition with everything else, it just feels like it's a further way to sort of obscure the human element from this movie. And of course, as mentioned, none of these manned military forces manage to do jack squat to Godzilla. All they really do is tick him off. The most damage that's inflicted is by the American stealth bombers, because they actually draw blood, but then again, in drawing that blood, all they ultimately do is make Godzilla evolve a new power that destroys them and winds up causing even more destruction. So it wasn't really worth it. Now again, it's not unheard of for the focus to be on vehicles in a kaiju movie rather than the people inside of them. We've seen that sort of thing before. It's common practice. But in a movie like this, when we juxtapose it to the fact that it's already ignoring people in the city, it feels like it's all connecting in a way that's pointing in a particular direction. But I don't think we're quite ready to reach a conclusion just yet. Let's go back a little bit in the timeline to when the helicopters are first launched to combat Godzilla's third form. You remember that scene, right? The helicopters all have him surrounded. Godzilla is polite enough to pause and wait to see what they do. And right as the PM is about to give the order to fire, we see two people somewhere in the vicinity. We have no clue where they are in juxtaposition to the helicopters or Godzilla, but apparently they're close enough that one of the pilots was able to see them even from all the way up in the air. And it is at this point that the PM makes that infamous decision to call off the attack, because he doesn't want these civilians getting caught in the crossfire or getting hit in collateral damage or anything. That's not something he wants associated with this attack. So the helicopters leave. Even detractors of this film call it a stupid decision, but I don't know if people have really thought about the further implications thereof. See, yes, it's true that technically speaking, the PM could potentially have solved the issue right there if he had just let the helicopters shoot. But he called it off because there were two people somewhere within a football field area radius of the action. And it was considered a dumb decision because maybe Godzilla could have been defeated at that point. Obviously we don't know, because nobody ever took a shot at Godzilla in that form, so we don't know how weak he might have been, but it was still considered stupid. But on the other hand, look at it from the PM's perspective. Presumably there have already been people killed. I mean, we don't ever actually see anybody, as mentioned, but that was caused by the monster. Had these two people been caught in the crossfire of a military attack against the monster, that would have been viewed as collateral damage. And I think we're looking at it from his perspective and wondering if perhaps he doesn't think that's worth it. If even one life gets taken that shouldn't have been by his order, that would have been seen as a bad thing. Even if it did successfully kill Godzilla, somehow it still might have come back to bite him in the butt politically, perhaps. Political or not, though, really think about what's being said here. The PM made a mistake because he valued the lives of two random people over the idea of killing Godzilla. What does that say about those two people? Are they worthless lives? I'll let you dwell on that before we get to the final part of this. Before I get to the last section, let's quickly review what we've learned so far. The movie is predominantly focused on the infrastructure of Tokyo, not necessarily concerned with people or what happens to them. A military movement that involves people at the controls does poorly when going up against Godzilla. A previous military attack is called off because two everyday people got in the way. How does the movie end, though? What is that final push to defeat Godzilla? The attack to knock him down so they can administer the coagulate involves three major components: a fleet of unmanned drones, a bunch of automated trains packed with explosives, and a bunch of empty buildings rigged for demolition. What do all of those have in common? That's right. None of them involve humans. Yaguchi and his team are a good distance away, like miles away from the action. Yes, out of safety, but like they're commanding it, but they're not technically there. All the stuff happening to Godzilla is being done through automation. And in fact, it is the infrastructure of Tokyo itself that brings Godzilla down. I mean, yes, people had to go in and set the bombs and the controls on the train and stuff. And yes, there are people administering that coagulate stuff once he's down, but he wouldn't be down for them to administer that stuff if the buildings hadn't been demolished first. The only successful attack against Godzilla in the whole movie does not involve any human beings actually on the scene, really. Think about that. The infrastructure of Tokyo, which this movie has a bizarre, almost fetishistic fascination with, is what brings Godzilla down. That's what defeats him. But you might say, well, wait a minute, Omni. What about the people in the government? Those are human beings, are they not? Well, in terms of being flesh and blood creatures with skeletons and muscles and a general humanoid shape, yes, they are humans. But in terms of how they're written, they're not people. I've established multiple times across multiple videos that the characters of Shin Godzilla are not characters because they have no backstories, they have no arcs, they have no development, there's nothing we know about them, they don't have any motivations, they are just there to be part of the system. They are cogs in a machine that only exists to serve the infrastructure. And there it is. Do you see it now? Shin Godzilla's propaganda is not really about 311. That's a Trojan horse. It uses that imagery to get you invested, or at least try, but the actual message it's putting forward is in presenting a vision of what Japan ought to be. And that vision of Japan has no room in it for humanity. Again, look at everything we've seen up to this point. When humanity was involved, they either failed to defeat Godzilla or they disrupted something that could have defeated Godzilla. The PM's mistake was valuing human life over defeating his enemy. Meanwhile, Godzilla is beaten by inanimate objects, rigged to be destroyed by people whose sole existence, their entire raison d'etre, is to be part of the system. They have nothing else to them outside of the system. They only live to play their specific role within the system. And if anything, they might actually feel contempt for the people who exist within the infrastructure that that system upholds. Consider another scene where, again, it's a distant shot of a crowd, so distant in fact that it's practically an amorphous blob, but they're chanting outside one of the government buildings, and inside, the people who work in the system discuss how that crowd is protesting the decision to kill Godzilla. They want him to be preserved. And there's this underlying sense of contempt for that crowd, like they're just poor ignorant fools who don't understand. Those are the people that supposedly this system is working to protect, except it's not really. Why would they? This movie doesn't care about people, remember? It cares about the buildings. So humanity is a bug, not a feature. And once the people who care about that humanity are eliminated, like the Prime Minister, who briefly went off book in the hopes of reassuring people that there was no reason to panic, or who called off an attack because a couple of people he didn't even know existed and would likely never have met in his life were in harm's way, once they're gone, then the system can run smoothly and do the stuff that actually needs to be done. Personally, I find that terrifying. Now, of course, I know that somebody might hear all of that and say, wait a minute, Omni, how do you know you're not reading too deeply into this? Isn't it possible that the way you're arranging these facts is perhaps not what the intended message was? You yourself have pointed out, Omni, that unintended messages work their way into stories all the time. And is it not possible that this is just another one of those examples? So is it not possible, Omni, that this movie is not glorifying the system and infrastructure the way you claim it is? Well, if we're going to invoke the law of averages, then sure, anything is possible. Heck, according to the law of averages, it's possible that Hideaki Anno simply found this script on his computer one day after an army of cats chased a mouse across the keyboard. However, you may recall that I did say this movie plainly states its thesis. This comes in a scene where, after they've gotten the files from Goromaki and they're all trying to decipher it, at one point Yagachi looks up from his work to rest his eyes. He looks around the room at this crowd of people who are each in their own little compartments, all doing their respective parts to keep the machine going. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing a little here, he says, "This is nice. I'm looking around this room and I'm seeing everybody working towards a common goal, all each doing what they need to be doing. This is the way it should be." It's in the movie. The movie clearly has this idea that this is the way things ought to function. It presents a bunch of people who have nothing to them. They just have a few archetypal things here and there at the most, and otherwise are just complete blank slates. but they're each serving a particular role in the system. And that crowd is presented as a good thing. This is the ideal Japan to this movie. And of course, it's nothing like that old system, which yes, had a bunch of red tape, but was also led by a guy who at least put some value on human life. It's in the movie, like I said. I don't think I am reading too deeply into it. The movie itself said what it's about. And yes, I know, Japanese culture has many things that make it distinct from American culture. One of those things is that in Japan, you're expected to have a very particular role in society. Whatever that role is, you are expected to fulfill it to the most of your abilities. If you don't have any sort of purpose, if you're just a hikikomori who's staying at home and playing dating sims and never leaving the house, it's thought that something is clearly wrong with you. I understand that. But even by that cultural standard, Shin Godzilla goes way too far by essentially dehumanizing the people of the system and telling them it's for their own good. I gotta say, that is incredibly misanthropic. It's not necessarily as misanthropic as the Polygon trilogy, of course, but then again, the Polygon trilogy at least had the decency to plainly state that it hates you. Shin Godzilla was a bit more insidious. It first presented you with a bunch of imagery and stuff that made you think it cares. But in actuality, it doesn't. It just wants you to fit into a little box and have nothing else to you. The scary part is that it worked. Everyone was focusing on what the movie wanted them to think. And like any sucker getting duped by a good salesman, they never actually thought about what price was being asked. Well, now you know the price. And what you do with that knowledge, I suppose, is entirely up to you. For my own part, though, this feels like a price that's too high to pay.
Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.